wonderful. How about you, man?
Hanging in there, hanging in there. Thank you for the opportunity to present basically a summary of a white paper that we created about 6 months ago. This presentation is a few months old and will kind of give an overview of what the contents of the white paper are all about. But then I think it would be interesting to kind of have a conversation about where we are and like what we have plans for in the current economic and political environment, and how we see this is actually a very viable and scalable solution for Baltimore and cities like Baltimore.
I'd like that. Let's go for it.
Awesome. So a little bit about ourselves. Trident Builders is a commercial general contractor located here in Maryland. We do about 50% federal, 50% private sector work. We kind of, I guess, pride ourselves on having an intense level of engagement and doing very technically sophisticated projects. The overview of this program is a concept that we rebranded from the Trident method to something called Be More, Build Forward. The reason why we rebranded it is we felt that it was somewhat disingenuous for such a concept that it would be so broadly adopted across the city, and it would have so many other co-participants in it if it was to be successful. It really didn't necessarily need to be branded Trident, and I think that would get kind of lost in the message. But basically, what we're looking to do is to figure out a better way. Conventional construction and what we're doing with the vacants hasn't worked for the last 50 years and is not going to work. I think everybody knows that the city itself has admitted that if we continue to do what it is we're doing, it's going to take 300 years to address the amount of vacancies we have in the city of Baltimore today. We need to come up with a different solution. Modular construction has long been around, but it's never really had the opportunity to scale and hasn't had a broader market support. And we see a pathway forward for Baltimore to become a hub for modular construction, and to really kind of scale and solve some of our problems. So rather than looking at the vacants as purely a headache and a problem, we really see it as an incredible market opportunity that Baltimore and the state of Maryland really need to seize. So basically, we're trying to tackle four major challenges that need market-based solutions in order to scale. The four problems that we're looking at is energy efficiency and climate change, the impact of blight, okay, the lack of affordable housing or really accessible housing. So it's not just like subsidized housing based upon AMI and affordable housing. That's somewhat of a misnomer. Like, we're trying to talk about affordability in housing, so accessible housing for like starter homes, like family formation and whatnot, as well as dealing with a challenge that we're dealing with in my industry in particular that no one's really kind of talking about. We're coming across a real severe workforce shortage in the construction industry. So climate change and resilience is a critical thing. And, Aaron, I got to, praise you for like your efforts and like some of the things that the statistics that you point out in terms of fatalities with like asthma and air quality control and everything that is, basically afflicting these communities from like an environmental built environment sort of perspective. The challenge is that housing and actually buildings in general contribute at least 40% of carbon emissions every year, either through new construction or the emission of heating and cooling. We talk a lot about electric vehicles, we talk a lot about wind turbines and solar panels, but if we're trying to get to net zero, if we don't focus on buildings in general and housing being the largest percentage of buildings in particular, we're never going to get anywhere close to net zero. So housing, it has to be front and center. It is the battle of the bulge in Normandy type of thing that needs to be addressed in order to be effective and achieve these goals. The challenge is that a new house being built today is expected to last 50 to 100 years. And so if it's not as close to net zero built today, there's no way that that house is not going to be contributing to carbon reductions in the next 10 to 20 years. Housing affordability is also a real challenge. We've seen median house prices raise almost by 33% in the Baltimore region in the last 10 years alone. Housing housing's role in the ability for a family to basically create wealth for themselves and intergenerational wealth cannot be understated. It is by and far the largest mechanism for people to accrue wealth over the course of their lifetimes. So one of the consequences we have in the city of Baltimore is we're in a sea of vacants. Officially, the number is actually now closer to 13,000, but we also have 21,000 vacant lots. The challenge with the the challenge with vacants is that it's almost both the symptom and the disease of poverty at the same time. Like it is a driver of poor economic prosperity and outcomes. At the same time, they are a public health disaster. These vacants, are often like covered in lead and asbestos and other hazardous materials that we no longer use in the construction industry, but they're burning down at twice the rate of the national average. And this basically creates a cloud of toxic air within these communities that are affecting these kids. And lead is tied to poor academic outcomes as well as anger issues. And these are exactly the type of things that these neighborhoods and communities that are struggling and have a lot of despair and trauma do not need. Johns Hopkins estimated that the vacant problem in Baltimore is costing the city $210 million every year. So it's really a problem that we can't afford not to take on. Lastly, what a lot of people are talking about is that my industry is suffering from an acute workforce shortage. The fact is that the average age of a construction worker in this country is about 43 years old, and 1 in 4 is over the age of 55. At a time when everyone's asking us to deliver more housing more affordably, to also repair aging and failing infrastructure, and then to invest and build out climate change resiliency and energy systems, we simply don't have the workers to do it. So we focus on the problems of the smaller urban scale developer. These are usually champions within these communities that have strong trust and roots in these communities, but they don't have the ability to take on larger scale projects that can use modular construction. So, rather than going through each one of these sort of line items, we can talk about this in our conversation, Aaron. But like what we basically saw was as a stakeholder that if we addressed very focused on the smaller scale urban developer, we should be able to deploy a scalable solution to the vacant problem, as well as nurse a nascent industry into existence right here in Baltimore. There's a sad irony in the same time that we have a workforce shortage, there's a lot of underemployed youth in our city. And that's a consequence of them being failed by a lot of institutions, not the least of them is the school system. We see an opportunity to do a construction methodology using modular construction that will be the ideal sort of split of labor between the factory and the field that will create an abundance of workforce development opportunities for Baltimore City youth. So basically we're focused on 3 customer groups: the small urban developers, okay, the local unemployed, but as well as the modular factory. And we see that if we have a integrated approach to working on these 3 customers, we can have a real effective change with regard to climate change, housing affordability, the removal of blight, as well as creating workforce development opportunities. I'll kind of skip this, but we have a first unit that's in pre-design, but we also have also demonstrated this with the Smithsonian Institute. Go ahead and kind of skip through this because this is something that has kind of been out there for a long time. But I feel as if, Aaron, you and I can have a more thoughtful conversation about this.
Sure.
But I just want to highlight something real quick. Where we had a real aha moment was that there was an opportunity at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is down in Edgewater, Maryland. We did a design build project there a couple of years ago, and what we ended up delivering was, in effect, the perfect starter home. It's about 1,500 square feet, 3 bedroom, 2 bath, right? It's ADA compliant on the first floor. And that was more of a government requirement. But when you think about what that would mean in the private sector, that would allow for, people like whole life housing meaning that people could age in place. One of the big challenges we've heard from the communities of Baltimore is that as people get older and they lose their mobility to go up and down stairs, they find themselves having to sell their house, all right, and move into very expensive assisted living facilities that basically wipe out all of the accrued wealth they've made over the course of their lifetime. So they basically are denied the ability to pass on intergenerational wealth. So Baltimore has no shortage of housing needs as well as no shortage of vacants. So it's an absolutely ideal place for us to start. By virtue of it being the westernmost port on the East Coast, right, it represents a place that it can reach deep into the Midwest and in areas other markets, but it also can export into say the Caribbean or other parts of the world. It just talks about the scalability and the speed of it, and some of the development partners we're already having conversations with. We've been talking to Blueprint Robotics. They're a facility that's located right here in Baltimore. What's interesting about them is they've imported state-of-the-art German technology. So this sort of methodology is actually pretty widely adopted in Germany. We actually invented passive house design parameters as even modular construction here in the United States. Interestingly, we've not adopted it and or perfected it. The Germans did. And so the Germans have more or less brought this technology back to us and have built a state-of-the-art facility right here in Baltimore. We've been working with workforce development partners, and we can talk about that, but it's probably not necessarily the main focus of this conversation. Aaron, you and I have enjoyed some great collaboration time through the Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities initiatives and like the collaboratory. The white paper that we issued about 6 months ago has become one of the main strategies of what they're trying to scale. And we're also in dialogue with Morgan State University. Again, this is, this is a very, very crude graph, but it talks about one of the ways we see solar being a way to, we're basically looking to integrate solar generation on top of these houses in a way that could passively create revenue to offset some of the operating costs for the homeowners and to prevent the houses from ever falling into vacancy. And it's really hard to skip all of this. There's a lot kind of going on, and like this is really, really dense, but I kind of want to blow through it. We do have a pilot project in design right now. It's in Brooklyn, and I'm excited to say that we have several other projects that we're in dialogue on, and we are literally after this phone call, I've got to send out a pre-construction agreement to a potential 100 unit development deal. So we see this as a real viable opportunity to scale this in Baltimore in the near term. Trident Builders is going all in on this sort of approach. And then I will kind of escape out of this and stop sharing, and we can begin our dialogue. So again, Aaron, I know there's a lot in that slide deck, and I'm trying to be concise. You and I have been talking about this, and I feel as if I'm doing like the audience a little bit of a disservice because they might not be all the way down the rabbit hole on this and haven't read the white paper. But that being said, we see housing as the central challenge in Baltimore to solve. But with housing and solving that problem, we see incredible opportunity for the city to reinvent itself and do things differently than other cities on the East Coast when it comes to their economic revitalization. We talk a lot about the biotech industry, we talk a lot about tech, we talk a lot about higher education. Those are all great. I think Baltimore really needs to embrace its industrial past and look at housing as being an incredible opportunity because, as horrific as the vacant challenge is in Baltimore and the havoc that it wreaks, housing's a nationwide challenge. And if we can scale the solution for ourselves, then we are actually seizing on a broader economic opportunity. And that's what I really see. And, and it has to be somewhat of a holistic approach. We need to be thinking about okay, you can't just like do new houses in the community and think that like all these problems are going to right themselves. Like if you're going to fix the neighborhood, you need to also kind of help fix the residents of the neighborhood. You need to provide them economic opportunity, and you need to do it in such a way that they're empowered and enfranchised to the revitalization of that community. I can't tell you how many just like little sort of stories of where we see kids in workforce development programs almost take a degree of ownership projects they've worked on in their communities to the point that they see someone like damaging or defacing work that they've done, they get quite
Mm,
angry and like they're very, very defensive of it. And
right.
so, like, thinking about like no one needs to kind of come into these communities and fix it for them. There are people within these communities that are ready to do it. They just need to be empowered with the right sort of technology. And that's what we see with the scalability of modular construction. It's fundamentally a economies of scale and logistics challenge, right? Like in order for us to drive down the cost of construction using modular, you need to do a certain amount of them. Like factories do well at mass producing things. The problem is that none of these smaller scale developers can either afford to do a large scale development, nor can the community really absorb 50 to 100 units at a time, right? So like so you have like this sort of absorption conundrum problem. But if we're able to kind of organize all skill developers together, like in a co-op, right? You're kind of like crowdsourcing their aggregate buying demand, and then you're able to kind of piece it together, and you're able to deliver. So like we might be able to do say 10 to 20 units in Waverly, or then 10 or 20 units in Brooklyn or Cherry Hill, but then we can go to Broadway East, and by virtue of kind of moving around slowly, you're kind of allowing these communities to heal at a rate that they can, right? But at the same time, you don't have one master developer trying to do it all themselves because no one has
Right.
the bandwidth to do that. You have all these smaller scale developers that know exactly what the needs are for that specific neighborhood, for that specific community, and giving them the resources for them to be successful. At the same time, you by standardizing the process to a degree, you start also eliminating a lot of the risk. Because you do something over and over and over, you perfect the model like anything else. And so, like, the idea is to kind of like ramp up a program that allows us to learn how to build more affordably, faster, with reduced risk, and for more people. So I will tell you firsthand, this sort of construction is not for jokers. You need to know what it is you're doing. But once you have it figured out, it's actually easier. Because when you think about what the process is in terms of hiring, rather than having, say, 26 different trade contractors out there and doing this in stick build, I got like 6 or 7. So just, this is that many less phone calls. And so you start zeroing down on what I'm
More
managing.
predictability as well.
Correct, correct.
Yeah.
So at that point, I'll turn it over to you for any sort of thoughtful questions and or observations.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a few questions here. Well, first, congratulations on what you're doing. This is totally awesome and exactly what we're looking for from our theme of this year. But the one thing that I didn't notice, and I'm sure you probably have it in your white paper or somewhere in your slides, is the fact that health and the social determinants of health and how homes are the number one determinant of health. Where are you kind of fitting in kind of the health and wellness of building occupants? Is it coming from the environmental certifications, Zero Energy Ready, or the Air Plus, Indoor Air Plus certifications? Like where does the health and wellness of building occupants play into your schema?
No, it's an excellent question. And the where the health and wellness kind of falls into, it's almost as if like a knock-on effect by virtue of the energy efficiency, right? So if we're building to current code and then even exceeding code, we're building a nice tight building envelope, right? That has air filtration and makeup air requirements.
And it's all electric, right?
It's all electric, yeah. So you're not off gassing anything, and so the predominant beneficiary is the person that's inside the dwelling unit because the indoor air quality is turning over at such a high rate, but it's also being scrubbed for any sort of contaminants. But also, by virtue of being a clean, all electric building, right, that is hopefully being powered by renewable energy, which is another kind of conversation point. Um, it's also going to be having less of a footprint on its neighbors, right? So there's no off gassing. So like the natural gas that's in my house, right? When the exhaust makes it out there, it's floating around in the basic environment. every one of these houses is going to eliminate that sort of, say, contaminant load within the airspace within the environment. And because of the density that you see in these communities, by virtue of being an urban environment versus a suburban one, that will actually have that proximity with the airflow and everything else, like really does have an effect.
So then, I guess my next question is just digging down a little bit more on that, just because I come to the space from a, healthy indoor air quality perspective. And you mentioned it earlier that Baltimore City unfortunately has the eighth highest rate of asthma emergency rate visits in the nation and the second highest rate of asthma related fatalities in the nation, primarily from some of these unserved, historically redlined communities. Talk to me a little bit about maybe the building materials that you're using. Are you really focused on kind of low to no VOC materials? And then that's my first question. My second follow-up is, how do you test to make sure and confirm that they're actually low to no VOC? Are you like monitoring indoor air quality with some of your projects, or how's that working?
Yeah, so we had to do that, in fact, for the government program, and like we feel as if like we're going to be designing to at least Department of Energy's net zero ready baseline, because that's where a lot of like the subsidies and targets and the Inflation Reduction Acts are targeted to. PHIUS is a standard above that. I think that we're going to design very close to PHIUS, but I don't think we're going to make ourselves that crazy with it. In terms of like the indoor air quality and testing, it's really it's less of the verification process, right? And hear me out on this one. Unless there's a standard in order for like there's some sort of incentive of a the issuance of a certificate, right? We're somewhat hesitant to do anything that adds any sort of general cost to the project, right? Because we're really challenged with the affordability side of it. That being said, we're very clearly and deliberately writing into the specifications material selections, but like don't require any that are low VOC, right? So
Mhm.
everything from paints to adhesives, like we're looking at exactly what the product is, and that's where like the greater degree of sophistication in this sort of construction is required. When I said like it's not for jokers, like you really kind of you're not just running to Home Depot, grabbing whatever you want to do off the shelf that day and throwing it in. Like in order for us to do the energy modeling for the building envelope, we need to be very, very deliberate on what all the various systems are in order for us to establish the air barrier, the vapor barrier, the moisture barrier, and like the thermal barrier. In order to do that and to like understand exactly what the R value of that building assembly is going to be along the perimeter, right? We need to know that it's a certainty product XYZ123, right? It's not like green board or the external sheathing. No, like the architect needs to tell us exactly what the model is and the thickness of it is in order for us to be able to do our energy calcs.
Mhm, mhm. It's interesting, and I'm sure any prospective buyers that are watching this, home buyers that are watching this, it's very difficult to find, net zero homes, zero energy ready homes, indoor air plus certified homes, asthma allergy friendly certified homes. It's like there's nowhere in the MLS system. I've been a practitioner, a real estate agent for 25 years. There's nowhere in the MLS system to kind of pick these buttons to try to pull up inventory that fits that criteria. So, what are you seeing in regards to what's your perceived or perspective in regards to kind of the demand? Is there like a pent up demand for these types of homes, especially post COVID?
I 100% believe that for a couple different reasons. I mean, so the energy side is one of the more interesting things. We started having some really interesting conversations with the Maryland Energy Administration about this, for a couple different reasons. The houses, by virtue of their energy efficiency, right, is going to have a much lower operating cost per month. So never mind the health and wellness thing, which is critically important. But I mean, let's just table that like that for a second and just talk about like the dollars and cents of it. Someone's energy bill is going to be about 20 to 30% of what it normally is, right? So you think about your mortgage, you think about your HOAs, okay, then you think about your energy bill. Well, if all of a sudden like you're able to reduce your $140 a month energy bill to 35 bucks a month, all right, that moves the needle. And I think people are gonna be attracted to that. Now,
Especially the
also
types of
knowing,
energy bills that we've gotten this month. We just got a $400 energy bill in our house. So.
dude, right? Yeah, 450 myself. Like, and I was like, dear Lord, I was like, all right, everyone's wearing coats. Yeah, we're going no electricity in February. right? Um, but then you also put like if anyone has an underlying health issue, right? The ability for them to find a house that's not going to exacerbate like their like their lung issues, right? I think is something that would be very attractive. And I think the last moving piece of this is, and we're still trying to figure out the contours of how to work this with like the utility, but like it's an active conversation that we're having, is how do we manage the solar? Because we see an opportunity to build a degree of resiliency and grid response. Um, this gets somewhat complicated, but basically the grid struggles during peak load times in the summer. And it just happens to be when these solar panels on these energy efficient roofs are actually producing the most net energy, right? So the house we did at the Smithsonian produced over 200% of the power they use day or night. It's not making anything in the middle of the night, which means that that sunny summer afternoon, right? It is making a boatload of like excess energy. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how do we help the grid and like basically offset carbon emitting electrical generation by virtue of all this extra energy. At the same time, how do we do battery backup and storage, right? So like when the grid goes down during, say, a storm event, or a wind event like we had here yesterday, how does that little, how can that community operate almost like an island? And so there's an awful lot of engineering that's kind of going into it. So you talk about like, what is the demand? It's kind of like Steve Jobs, that the client doesn't, like the customer, like doesn't know that they want this
They just want it
as much as
faster
they
always,
want,
right?
they're going to want this when they find out that it's available.
Right, exactly. So then, so do the homes at the Smithsonian, do they have battery storage backup, or the homes that you're looking at developing here in the city, will they have battery storage backup? I know they're required to, I guess, by code to be EV ready. But will they
Mhm.
have a battery backup, or how are you planning on working that
Right.
in?
So Smithsonian did not have battery backup by virtue of them having, because being a government facility, they had on-site diesel generators, right?
Okay.
So there wasn't necessarily a need for
Mhm.
that. These houses in Baltimore, if we can make it work, we'd like to engineer them with battery backup or some. It gets very kind of interesting, and like what we might do on the first set of projects might just kind of keep it simple and do like a net metering thing where it's backfed. What we really like the idea of is actually aggregating the solar generation with something that's called an independent power producer, short as IPP, right? And have that be part of like the cooperative with the developers. So it might be like, say like a subsidiary of the co-op that is doing like owner rep services for all these developers. This could be like an entity underneath that would allow them to, again, be another profit center. We're trying to figure out market driven solutions for this stuff.
Understood. So you have a few minutes for a few more questions? I know you got another meeting coming up.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
All right. Volumetric offsite construction versus panelized. It sounds like you're headed down the panelized path versus volumetric. What made you make that decision between the two, and what would you see as the benefits or cons of either
Yeah,
strategy?
that's a phenomenal question. So, um, volumetric can be done very, very well, right? And it can be done to a high degree of quality. I like panelized for several reasons. One, um, we can probably get to a greater degree of standardization on the factory level with standardized pieces, right? It's like creating Legos versus like creating building blocks, right? So if we can mass produce the same Lego piece over and over and over again, you're driving down the cost. And so that's where I see the scalability of it. Second, by virtue of being the general contractor, okay, myself or any other builder is essentially responsible for safety and quality control through the construction process. By being panelized, there's enough of it that is still left exposed that we can verify as an independent party and play our vital role in terms of quality control to know that things are getting done and the materials that are coming out are quality products. All right. So like there's a degree of transparency within the assemblage that I think also lends itself. Thirdly, it's practical. Like, driving a tractor trailer with a big box on it through Baltimore city streets with power lines and everything else is a heck of a lot harder. I can have, whereas these panelized structures, like we could lift these things into place with a simple forklift, get underneath like the power lines and whatnot, or a couple of guys can actually pick these things up and drop them into place. So from a practical construction execution standpoint, I see an advantage there. And then finally, God, there's so many things. The customizability of it too. So like when you're doing volumetric, the thing that you're standardizing is a bigger and bigger box, right? And I kind of spoke to it in the first point, but like I really do see Baltimore, if we're going to become a hub for manufacturing, there's a greater degree of flexibility with going with smaller pieces, if that makes sense. And
Understood.
in general, like the time difference between the two of them, we're saving so much time in general that even if we lost an additional 3 or 4 weeks in the construction cycle, who cares? We saved ourselves 4 or 5 months. Like 3 or 4 weeks is nothing. And then lastly, because we're trying to do this with the mindset of kind of creating opportunities for Baltimore City youth, like the division of labor, if you do more in the factory, you're basically stealing an opportunity for a semi-skilled job to be created in the field. Okay, and I think the idea is for us to kind of help stimulate economic activity in these communities. Both the smaller scale urban developer, also creating a bunch of kids that know how to do a side hustle. They know how to hang sheetrock, they know how to paint, they know how to put trim in. We're teaching that young man to fish, and I think that's kind of what like the thought process is, and where I see, the more if I do everything panelized or volumetrically within a factory, I'm starving the opportunities that these neighborhoods need. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. Last question. So it sounds like you and I read the same McKinsey article back in 2016, 17 about the construction industry being the least digitized, declining in productivity, and having a strong resistance to change. That and
Right, and it's like in this era of cell phones, like we were more effective in 1968 than we are today, which is crazy.
so with all of the lumber and the labor going to the West Coast to build 50,000, 60,000 homes over the next 10 years, where does that leave the East Coast in regards to being able to, have the amount of labor that we need and having the amount of materials that we need at an affordable price? Kind of how do you see that all working out?
It's interesting that you asked that question in this current political environment. You know, the, because 6 months ago I wasn't too concerned about it. Right. I think that, if there was enough demand, like we just see the surge of it. But with the prospect of tariffs, particularly from Canada on Canada, I see, everything from aluminum to steel to particularly white pine lumber
I mean,
escalating
it
and
takes
just
85 to 125 trees to build one house. So, like, where, where's all the lumber coming from if we got tariffs?
yeah, exactly. Right. It's got to come from somewhere. I mean, a lot of it comes from Georgia. A lot of it comes from Mississippi. I mean, like there's big industrial activity down there, but a lot of our lumber comes from Canada. And these are things that we just need to be thoughtful of. It's like, are we shooting ourselves a degree in the foot in some of these things? Like, politics aside, right? Like, just I don't have the bandwidth. Like, I'm focused on running a business, and I'm focused on this very specific problem. I'm somewhat agnostic politically regarding everything that's kind of going on. But, are we hurting ourselves on something that we just fundamentally need in terms of resolving bigger issues?
Yeah.
It's are we solving a small problem but letting a larger problem fester? My personal opinion, we're letting a very large problem fester.
Yep. Yep. So, how do emerging developers plug into the co-op, plug in with you, and get engaged?
Well, that's the beautiful thing is that there's so many great people already doing things. There's at least a half dozen different, like Armstead Jones, right, is organizing a bunch of developers together. Right, there's another consortium of other smaller scale developers. We're tied into all of these. What we're going to be doing really with Johns Hopkins is we're kind of building this pilot program somewhat open book. Right, the idea is to kind of like let's it's going to be we're going to make the sausage together, right? It's going to be gross, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to identify where there's areas for efficiency, right? But like we're going to then figure out how to scale it, and like how do we do everything. I mean, we just started a program with the Carey School of Business where I am going to have like 3 grad students, like looking over my shoulder as we're kind of putting this program together. How can we incorporate artificial intelligence? to streamline the project management process or to organize the workflow chart. Like anything we can do to shave time and management costs is a step in the right direction in terms of affordability. Right now, we're basically at either cost parity or maybe a slight premium, but we're a hell of a lot faster,
Right.
right? And so if we can figure out a way to trim everywhere we can in terms of the management side, we'll get there. Like we'll get to
Yeah.
cost parity or below.
If you can get
And
to the
at that
bag
point,
quicker, if you can get to the
yeah.
bag quicker, that makes all the difference. Yeah.
Well, and I think people, sorry, I'm a contractor at heart. So like I look at time equals money all day long. Right. And I don't think people really understand like the importance of the speed of delivery.
Mhm.
If someone's trying to turn around a neighborhood, okay, doing 5 or 10 units over a course of 2 years isn't doing anything to really change the nature of that neighborhood. But if you're able to do 5 to 10 units in 5 to 6 months, okay, let them get absorbed, and then you're able to do another 5 to 6, in another 6 months or 7 months, and you're hitting with concurrent waves and just chipping away at the problem. All of a sudden, that neighborhood will start to see positive economic change.
Brendan, I know this was probably the least dollar productive activity that you'll do all day, but I do appreciate your time. This has been awesome. This is exactly what we're looking for. And your message and your thought leadership on the subject is perfect timing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. You have a good day.
You too, man. Bye-bye.